Hey there, internet friends. Welcome to another episode of That D Plus Show. Class is in session for the only show from that nerdy site that lets you know what kind of quality to expect right from the name. I'm your host, Trevor Starkey, and each week we dive into a different Disney Plus offering and discuss its history, how it holds up today, and our general impressions. Joining me today, we have nobody. I'm doing a quick little solo episode this week. In between kind of big event Star Wars and Marvel debut episodes, I'm doing an episode on Frank and Ollie, a couple of historic Disney animators that had a documentary made back in the mid '90s about them. It's something that I think I've probably first became aware of like back around the time Disney Plus launched, and I was like binging or watching through the Imagineering story. I'm pretty sure it was like one of those, like, here's another, if you like Disney history, here's another one for you. And so as I was looking for something to kind of do to fill this week out, didn't really get any recommendations or suggestions from any of my That Nerdy Site colleagues. So I thought I'll just kind of knock this one out, check it out, and see how it goes. And so yeah. I was basically looking for a random option and landed on this documentary. Before we dive into that, though, a little bit of housekeeping. Next episode, as I alluded to, is going to be the Miss Marvel is debuting next week. So we will do next week's episode based around the introductory episode or episodes of Miss Marvel. I don't know how many they're releasing next week, but we will be chatting about that next week. Then I got another TBD week currently, but then at the end of the month, our episode for June 24th will be our Obi-Wan Kenobi wrap-up episode, as that series is already halfway through at this point. But yeah, so diving into Frank and Ollie, this was originally released October 20th, 1995. Other releases of the time, you had Get Shorty and Mallrats came out that same day in 1995. You had Leaving Las Vegas came out October 27th. Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls came out November 10th. Goldeneye, shout out to our That Bond show, came out November 17th of 1995. The breakthrough for Pixar, Toy Story, came out November 22nd, and the original Jumanji came out December 15th, 1995. I would have been 10 years old when all this stuff was coming out. Runtime, it is not 50 minutes. It was about an hour and a half, I want to say. I did not update my doc with that, but yeah, it was about an hour and a half, I feel. In the Disney live action timeline of things, you had A Kid in King Arthur's Court came out August 11th, 1995. Then you had The Big Green came out September 29th. Then you had Frank and Ollie here documentary on October 20th. Tom and Huck would follow December 22nd. It's kind of in here because it's kind of live action, but it's also Muppets. Muppet Treasure Island came out February 16th, 1996, and Homeward Bound to Lost in San Francisco came out March 8th, 1996. And I'm pretty sure also that was kind of the live action timeline of Disney, but I'm pretty sure that was also just, for the most part, Disney's timeline at that point in time. Because they didn't have Toy Story, or they didn't have Pixar. They were distributing on behalf of Pixar, but and then yeah, like this was, I think, in the gap between, what was it, like Pocahontas and Hunchback of Notre Dame, I think, in terms of like their animated stuff. So like it was just kind of a live action flurry there for a little while. The roll call of this one, we have the director and writer being Theodore Thomas. He did, in addition to this Frank and Ollie documentary, he also did a documentary called Walt and El Grupo, another Disney documentary about Walt Disney, as well as he's credited for the Growing Up with 9 Old Men documentary. So lots of Disney documentary stuff in his repertoire. Frank, and then the starring, I basically have Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston as the titular Frank and Ollie. Rather than run through their credits, I basically have their like Wikipedia, blurbs pulled up here. Frank Thomas joined Disney in 1934. He went on to author the Animators Bible, The Illusion of Life, with Ollie Johnston. His work included The Wicked Stepmother in Cinderella, The Queen of Hearts in Alice in Wonderland, and Captain Hook in Peter Pan, as we see a little bit of in this film. Frank was also responsible, as the film touches on, for the iconic spaghetti scene in Lady and the Tramp. Ollie Johnston, on the other hand, joined Disney a little bit later in 1935. He first worked on Snow White. He would go on to also, with Frank Thomas there, author the Animators Bible, The Illusion of Life. His works include Mr. Smee in Peter Pan, The Stepsisters in Cinderella, the District Attorney in The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, and Prince John in Robin Hood. We see a lot of those, not Cinderella and not The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, but we do see Mr. Smee and Prince John featured heavily in this film. And according to the book The Disney Villain, also written by Johnston and Frank Thomas, Johnston also partnered with Thomas on creating characters such as Ichabod Crane and Sir Hiss in Robin Hood. Other starring really are, a couple of other documentarian talking heads, and then also their respective spouses that I will touch on in a little bit. But the additional trivia here, the 9 old men were named in the early 1950s, and as Disney delegated more tasks to them when he went off to focus on the parks. They were basically animators that had been with him since early days of Disney animation. All of them, I believe, were on board at Disney by the time Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs rolled around. The 9 old men were Les Clark, Mark Davis, Ollie Johnston, Milt Kahl, Ward Kimball, Eric Larson, John Lounsbury, Wooly Reitherman, and Frank Thomas. And Frank and Ollie would be the last surviving members, with Frank passing away in 2004, followed by Ollie as the sole survivor until 2008 when he passed away. Frank and Ollie were honored with a final voiced cameo in The Incredibles in 2004. They can be seen and heard as the 2 old men at the end of the film, saying, "That's old school, yeah, no school like the old school," after the heroics by the family at the end when they've saved the day. Nice little nod to their long lineage and work within the Disney family. Does it hold up today? It's interesting. As a documentary, it definitely doesn't have the pacing or the feel of a modern documentary. I like the most modern documentary thing I liken this to would be the Movies That Made Us kinds of vibes, which most recently I think I've talked about on this series in terms of the Behind the Attraction series, is basically by the same people of that, where it's talking heads, but they're interjecting and editorializing and writing a lot of a script around the notions that they're getting there. This is much more letting the subjects do the talking. In particular, it is a lot of interviews with Frank and Ollie together at one of their seemingly dining room tables kind of thing, or interviews with their partners or a few other miscellaneous people. But it is a very personal kind of thing, intermixed with, I would say, the most production behind this goes into, there's clearly a lot of interstitials where Frank and or Ollie are acting out a classic Disney scene that they animated, and then so you're seeing them as the actor, and then you're seeing the finished product basically in animation form. And obviously they would have originally acted these out when they were much, much younger, and then kind of used themselves as the guidance and the direction for the animation that they were doing. And so it's interesting to see them doing it here at their, significantly advanced age in the mid 90s here. But it still touches on, I think, one of the crucial elements of what helped these two kind of thrive in is that they have such a joyful, playful energy to them that they would make big choices in terms of like big acting choices themselves that that then informed how they would animate a lot of these characters. So I think that was a cute little or like a cool little way of helping illustrate that element. It doesn't feel modern in that sense by really any means. This is a almost a 30-year-old documentary at this point, but it still, I think, does a good job of kind of telling their story because so much of it is just them telling their own story. It kind of starts with the two of them talking about going to Stanford together and kind of their pre-Disney days where they were taking art school at Stanford. But they tell this little anecdote about how there was such an uproar when a nude model arrived that Stanford was like, we're never going to have nude models again. And so they ended up having to go, a couple hours up the road to get their like life drawing experience classes. And then on their way back, they talk about going to the little bars on the way back and kind of trading. Frank would play piano and Ollie would like hand in the paintings and stuff they would do in exchange for like free drinks and stuff at these little bars. And it's like, oh, the 1930s, what a quaint and cute little era of things. They tell kind of each of their origin stories of getting into animation, which obviously was not like a renowned job here in the at the time. But Ollie talks about and we see kind of clips of the cartoon where he fell in love with animation as Pluto gets stuck to flypaper. And is just constantly having to kind of struggle in the comedic ways with dealing with that. And then Frank tells a similar story of seeing The Flying Mouse, a Disney short, and basically falling in love with the emotion and the character and the feeling they put into the characters of that. It talks about being hired on at $17 a week, which during Depression era 1934, still pretty solid. And then, as I touched on above or earlier, Ollie would go on to join him the following year. But like throughout all of this, they're thick as thieves. They're roommates. They're basically like through it all, through all of what will come. They're pretty much together. It's almost like they are life partners, and yes, they both have spouses in turn, but it's Frank and Ollie for a reason. They're the rare creative influence that is like just they click, they accentuate each other's weaknesses, they strengthen each other, and would go on to define a or help define those early eras of Disney, especially as the documentary kind of touches on later, like when Walt Disney passes, they are some of the ones really kind of as the driving force of the animation side at that point. And yeah, they just have this like eternal friendship. I mean, the movie, the documentary, like multiple times shows them the fact that they're just living next to each other at this point in their lives, in their what probably would have been, I guess, 80s. They just have houses next to each other out there in California. And that like it's established that is established itself very early on with just like a shot of the two of them taking out their garbage and having little banter back and forth, and then heading back into their houses. And at one point, I think I don't remember if it's Frank goes to Ollie's for a lot of like the interviews or to discuss about like the next book they're working on, or Ollie goes to Frank's, but it's basically like that. It's they walk out of their place, walk over next door, tell the missus, yeah, I'll be back for lunch, and that's it. They're just all these years later, they are still together, really. Um, they touch on uh, stories that I've certainly heard a lot of over the years, but for those that don't know, they talk about the tale of Disney's Folly, which was what kind of the industry was calling Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs because it was a significant risk. Full length animated features were not a thing at that time, and the fact that Walt Disney was putting so much of his weight and resources behind that, it could have very easily bankrupted them. They talk about how the basically they ran out of money in the making of it, and in order to secure the loan to finish the project, they kind of had to show a very preliminary unfinished version to a banker, and the banker watched it and basically was like, yeah, finish the thing, we'll give you the money you need, this is going to be something really special. And one of the talking heads in the piece talks about the emotional weight of the art, and the quote I really appreciated was, it was when all of the dwarves are crying around, the presumed dead Snow White, her funeral bier. They talk about the idea that this was when moving pictures became moving pictures. And just the emotional, like seeing these characters cry and the audience welling up with tears in response as well. It's at this point we start getting introduced to the respective spouses, Marie Johnston and Jeanette Thomas, kind of sharing their stories and their additional insight on their husbands. Obviously, they're also, thick as thieves and best friends. It's basically like a lifelong pair of doubles dates. That's just like so adorable and cute. Um, we get a little bit of like the philosophy behind Ollie and Frank, where Ollie, Frank talks about Ollie having this. It's introduced in the way of like Frank talks about Ollie's philosophy and Ollie talks about Frank's philosophy, which is a cool little kind of like twist. And Frank tells the story that like Ollie on his easel has kind of like sticky notes saying what is the character thinking and why does he feel that way, and that's his approach to animation. Whereas Ollie talks about Frank being a lot more analytical, and kind of like matter of fact in what he's doing. We get and our first kind of look at like an extended sequence that one of them worked on is or actually both of them, I guess. But like we get kind of Bambi, we get elements of Ollie working on Thumper in Bambi, and kind of the like bashful and bored retelling of the edicts that his father has said many times over. He kind of like how he figured that out and kind of decided he wanted to approach that. And then we get the extended sequence of Frank animating Thumper and Bambi on the ice in that film, kind of working through Thumper trying to teach Bambi how to skate. Frank talks about as somebody who, as he was, terrible at skating himself, he was hoping that he could get audiences to empathize with Bambi as he, a stand-in for him. We see or we hear kind of tale of how World War II basically like almost killed the studio because films like Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bambi weren't making the money. Um, uh, so they basically had to kind of like stick it out through some tough times there, and then eventually Walt, obviously in the late 40s, early 50s, starts really getting this notion in his head that he's going to build this theme park, this amusement park, and the Disney parks that would, of course, launch in 1955 and go on and change the world of amusement parks. But as Walt became so much more focused and invested in that, he left it to Frank and Ollie and the rest of the nine old men to really focus on the animated side of the company. We get a sequence here of Frank animating the spaghetti scene from Lady and the Tramp, as I touched on earlier, and just the like hearing him talk about it is like just it's that great, like it's director's commentary kind of thing that you would get in those kinds of special features of here's here's why I made Lady kind of like seem demure and stuff, but then you can see in Tramp's face how he's falling for her, and he's eating, he eats twice as much spaghetti in that moment because he's from the streets. He doesn't know when his next meal is going to come, whereas Lady does, and she doesn't need to scarf it down kind of thing. But then you see this smile on Tramp's face as he nuzzles over the meatball and stuff, and it's just like hearing Frank tell the story of that scene is as fun and impactful as watching it. um we hear kind of Walt's key memories of both these men, whereas Ollie is the train guy, and ultimately would like feed into Walt's love of trains, or kind of like spark Walt's love of trains. And we see Ollie having, back in the the 40s and 50s, kind of created his own little like miniature railroad around his acreage or whatever. And then we get to cuts to kind of like the 1990s version of that, where he's got like just a straight up locomotive a la the size of the trains at Disneyland, basically, that he's driving people around in a park on. So Ollie was the train guy, and then Frank was the piano guy, the music guy. And we see kind of extended clips of Frank playing with the Firehouse 5+2, which was a notorious kind of band made up of animators. And they talk about how both of these hobbies helped keep these guys sane after the long hard hours of animating, and really are the things that really helped get them through the day, and all that stuff. um the fact that both these guys and their families started basically in the same, like within a week, both of them had their first son, rather, within a week of each other. um just lots of cool stuff there. We start seeing kind of how their animating partnership blossoms with sequences between Alice and the Doorknob and Captain Hook and Shmee from Peter Pan, where one of them would be animating one of those characters, and they talk about the idea of, which is just something I don't even think about necessarily in terms of animation, but like wanting or not wanting to be the one that like is the focal point for the camera, so that like they talk about like when we can focus on Captain Hook so that like he can be making these big grand gestures, and when we can be focusing on Smee who's responding to Captain Hook's big grand gestures, and just like cool little fun bits like that. um we see sequences from The Sword and the Stone, where Frank, in particular, animated the squirrel sequence where Arthur gets turned into a squirrel, and then an actual squirrel kind of like immediately falls in love with him and then is heartbroken as he turns back into a boy. We get an animated sequence from Ollie in that film, where Archimedes the owl just doubles over and has a hard time breathing because he's laughing so hard, and just the joyous infection of that sequence is lovely. And then one of the kind of final stories that the documentary leaves us on is the Jungle Book, which would turn into a an important turning point for the company, because much like the haunted house over in the Disneyland side of things, this would be the first project really completed without Walt. Walt Disney would pass during the production of Jungle Book. They talk about this idea that Walt had a meeting with the team behind Jungle Book, and they were trying to figure out how to break the final, the end of the story, and Walt suggests bringing this girl into the story that can kind of help entice Mowgli back into the Man Village, and Frank and Ollie talk about how that was the last time they met with Walt. He would pass a couple months later, and they didn't know how much, like a lot of people, because of how kind of close he kept it to himself. They didn't know how sick he was, and as a result, they really had to help drive the force behind that. They the film, or the documentary talks about, they animated over half that film together, and it was very much like a make or break. If this fails, there's a good chance Walt Disney Animation doesn't continue because Walt Disney is no longer a driving force behind it. So how is this company going to last after he's gone? Much like the Disney parks, how are they going to last in the hands of the Imagineers without their fearless leader up driving the ship? Um, but yeah, we see, notably a lot of Mowgli and Blue sequences, and kind of the rationale and the mentality behind a lot of that work, and then we see that kind of ending of the film, those elements of the girl kind of like enticing. I think they use the word seducing, and like Ollie, I think, says like, yeah, it was my job to get her to seduce Mowgli, and Frank kind of does this like, they're like 10 years old, man. They shouldn't be seducing. I think, like, he jokes like, I would have said a different word. I would have said luring, I think. And it's like, it's just this fun, the fun banter between these two characters, between Frank and Ollie, is such a delight, and the heart of really this documentary. And then we wrap up with a lovely little montage of Frank playing piano while Ollie's out there driving a train. They've obviously, they by this point in time, they're no longer working day to day with Disney, but they're routinely still collaborating on writing and producing animation books. So we see, a lot of interstitials throughout of them working together on that. But yeah, I think that some of the funnest elements were, them standing on like a white screen, kind of like acting out little moments and doing big faces or gestures or something, and then seeing the characters do those same faces or gestures as they deliver the lines. Really helps drive home that they were putting themselves into these characters, and they were basing these characters off of themselves many times, because that's who they could reference. They could, they're sitting at their desk, they can be drawing this person. We see multiple times of them, looking in a mirror and doing a big face kind of thing, and then figuring out, okay, what am I doing in this? Okay, I'm gonna draw that. And yeah, it's just some really cool stuff. In terms of the report card, where we grade from A plus to F, I'll give this I'll give this an A. I think it is it's again, it's not, it's not a groundbreaking documentary in any fashion, but the joy of the friendship between these two men that has spanned 60, 70 years is just such a delight. And they've been, together through thick and thin, through it all, and are still, thick as thieves at the end. It's just so lovely. And a lot of the other, people involved, like, one of them is the art director for The Lion King, which obviously was like the big, one of the biggest recent hits at that time, kind of thing. Like, a lot of them just talk about the idea that, like, especially in 1995, let alone the preceding, half a century that would have led up to this, or that this friendship had been going on, like, real true, like, male friendship and male bonds was not that, that was not in vogue. Even today, obviously, is still like the toxic masculinity and all that stuff still plays such a pervasive role in male relationships, that just seeing the pure joy and friendship between these two, like, it feels extra special because of, knowing that kind of stuff. So yeah, gets an A just from, getting to learn about their story. It was a delightful little way to spend an evening. Extra credit, other suggestions if you like this one. You have Waking Sleeping Beauty, another kind of early Disney animation documentary. The Boys, the Sherman Brothers story about the iconic composer duo, the Sherman Brothers. Saving Mr. Banks, Into the Unknown, Making Disney's Frozen 2. Howard, the Imagineering story, which is the only one of these that actually has a corresponding That D Plus show already out there. You can go catch That D Plus show, episode 4, one of our very earliest episodes, where Cameron and I think talked about the Imagineering story, about the parks side of things. You can also see Pinocchio as well as Sketchbook. Pinocchio was another one that got featured pretty prominently in this documentary as well. Extracurriculars. What else am I watching on Disney Plus? I think pretty much the only other thing I really watched on Disney Plus this week was the third episode of Obi-Wan. Still really enjoying that series and where they continue to go with it. For more thoughts on that, you can join me and Cameron talking about it from last week, or come back in a couple weeks' time and we will give our full thoughts there on the finale of the series. So yeah, that is going to do it for this week's episode of That D Plus Show. Thank you for joining me to talk about Frank and Ollie. You follow me at Trevor J Starkey on Twitter. In addition to checking out other That D Plus shows, I will encourage you to check out That Bond Show, which is nearing its end. It is our limited run exclusive on YouTube podcast. We are peek behind the curtain. We've recorded the No Time to Die episode. We're done with that. We have, I think, one more kind of like final, like, let's talk about the entire series as a whole wrap up episode that we're going to record. But that's still rolling out this coming week's episode. So tomorrow, if you're listening to this the day this goes live, will be Skyfall, which I don't think will surprise anybody is, a phenomenal standout in the Bond series. So you can hear mine and Logan's thoughts on that by going to youtube.com/thatnerdysite Saturday mornings at 9 a.m. Pacific to go find that. You can follow all the latest from us over at That Nerdy Site or go to thatnerdysite.com. If you liked what you heard, please like, rate, review, subscribe, share the podcast with your friends, all that fun stuff. Thank you for joining me. As always, stay nerdy, be good to each other, and class dismissed.